he and Chris did have a lot of fun, certainly in the early years. As things went on, not to give away the plot, as it were, but things got a little hairy towards the end. But 415 had a lasting impact. They established some new ways of doing business in the music industry with things. There weren't necessarily terms like guerrilla marketing and relationship marketing back in the very early 80s, late 70s and early 80s, but that's what Howie was doing. The two of them were at the forefront of a resurgence of independent labels. They really recognized the importance of the music and also the importance and relevance of college radio, of non-commercial college radio, as a way to get that music out to people. And Disturbing the Peace is the story of 415 Records and the bands that were on the label. The way the project came about for me to get involved in this, because am I from San Francisco? No, I'm not. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. And during the years that all this was happening, I did visit San Francisco, but I grew up in Atlanta. But in late summer 2020, a small reissue label called Liberation Hall did some CD reissues of music from the early days of 415, from its indie period. And these are those. And because of the San Francisco focus of a lot of that music, because with only a very couple minor exceptions, or notable exceptions rather, most of the artists who were on 415 were based in the Bay Area. What I did is I pitched a story to SF Weekly, the alt weekly in San Francisco, because I was writing for them regularly at the time. And so I did a story on those reissues and on 415. For that, I interviewed about a half dozen people, including Howie Klein, members of the Mutants, the Ready Mades, the Uptones, and a band called SVT, who featured notably a bass player named Jack Cassidy, who most people, if they recognize that name, and well, they should, they'll know of Jack Cassidy as a member of Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna. But in fact, he was in a sort of new wave group as well. In the process of doing those half dozen or so interviews, I realized there was much more to this story. And my connection to my sort of understanding of 415 Records back in those days came from some of their later releases, when 415 had entered into a relationship with Columbia CBS. There were two records in particular. One was Wire Trains Between Two Words, and the other was Translators Evening of the Harvest. Both of those records really were a big part of the soundtrack of my college years. So the idea of being able to move beyond the SF Weekly piece and do a larger project, a book even perhaps, about 415 was something I found really intriguing. The SF Weekly story ran in the Thanksgiving 2020 issue of and then not long after that, I approached Todd Novak at Hozak Books. Hozak, for those of you who may not know, is also a very respected punk record label out of Chicago. He agreed that the story was one worth telling. And so once the holidays got over, once we got to January 2021, I started lining up interviews. In January through March, in the first 90 days of last year, I interviewed 96 people. And in the second quarter of 2021, April through June, I wrote the 53 chapters of the book and edited it. The pandemic, of course, has been a really terrible thing in almost every way imaginable. One thin silver lining is the fact that just about everyone I wanted to speak with was home. So they had time to talk to me should they have chosen to do so, and 96 of them did, in fact. One of the really cool things about the project, which was kind of unexpected for me, was the images. When I started interviewing people, I would ask them by the way, do you have any pictures or anything that, you might be able to share? And essentially, I had an eye towards collecting a few of those to be used in the marketing and the promotion of the book once it came out. What happened instead is that so many of the people that I interviewed opened their private archives to me, and I ended up with over 750 images, posters, handbills, tickets, set lists, buttons, professional photographs, snapshots, on and on. And over 300 of those have found their way into the book, which was something that I really, really did not expect. It wasn't part of the original concept, but once I started realizing what kind of material I was getting, I was thrilled to be able to add that. One of the people that I interviewed was Joel Selvin, a longtime San Francisco Chronicle music writer and author of many books, including a recent favorite, Hollywood Eden, which is just a really, really interesting story about the sort of the whole scene among high school age people, many of whom went on to become famous in the LA area. I've talked a little bit about 415. The first release on the label was a 45. A band approached Howie and Chris. Again, at this point, they were just DJs. They were DJs, and asked them, hey, would you release our song, our single? And they did it essentially as a favor. Once that happened, the floodgates opened. That first 45 was by a punk band called the Nuns. The most notable member of the Nuns was today a highly respected artist, Alejandro Escovedo. But once other bands saw that the Nuns had a single, Howie and Chris started getting all kinds of inquiries. Hey, can you release ours? And that 45 was followed by releases, either 45 RPM singles or EPs, a 45 with more than 2 songs on it. There were releases by the Offs, the Imposters, Pearl Harbor and the Explosion, SVT, and a number of others. Not long after that, 415 released one of its first albums, a compilation called 415 Music, oddly enough. And if that picture looks a little bit familiar, it's because photographer Hugh Brown allowed use of it on the cover of my book. A bunch of local Bay Area bands are on the 415 Music Comp, which, if you can find a copy, is really, really worth listening to. A modified version of it was among those releases that came out from Liberation Hall, and that's called Still Disturbing the Peace. End of commercial for Liberation Hall. Great label. Let's see. The 415 also released albums in those early days by a synth punk band called the Units and a psychedelic rock hero, Rocky Erickson. The story of Rocky's album for 415 is a really, really interesting one that I'm not going to get into. If you don't know it, it's fascinating. And the album was produced by Stu Cook, who's best known as the bassist from Creedence Clearwater Revival. I'll just give you a hint and tell you that the recording involved mental institutions. So we'll just leave that at that. As the 415 artists started, touring and releasing music, they found themselves in a position where they really needed more tour support. And of course, tour support is just a fancy way of saying money. And that's something that Howie and Chris didn't really have. So as major labels began to kind of take an interest in what 415 was doing, they were having kind of a small intensity success, and the majors had really no foothold in any sort of new wave punk kind of thing. And so I think the thinking among a lot of the major labels was, let's buy our way into this. We'll buy our way into this small market. We'll throw some money at it, see what happens. What was happening though is 415 kept getting offers to buy the contract of a band called Romeo Void, great group that released this EP, Never Say Never, produced by Rick Ocasek of the Cars. And it has the title track, which if you've heard it once, you'll remember it. Most of you probably heard it many, many more times. I Might Like You Better If We Slept Together. Great, great song from Romeo Void. Howie and Chris didn't want to sell Romeo Void's contract. They wanted something that would bring all of their artists into a better situation. So they turned down all the offers that were to just try to buy Romeo Void out from the label, and instead entered into a distribution deal with CBS/Columbia. Swept up in that deal were three other bands: Translator, Red Rockers, and Wire Train. And all of those four bands would all release albums, multiple albums on 415/Columbia. Later in the 415 saga, another band was signed until December, and they released one album. Eventually, Howie and Chris realized that the association with Columbia was not really what they had hoped it was going to be. I think a lot of the personal interaction and real authentic organic nature of doing business and supporting the artists kind of went away. So Chris bailed out, and a couple of years later, Howie left as well. There was a key man clause in the 415 Columbia contract by which Columbia had the right, should Howie leave, of basically dumping the label. And that's more or less what they did. And so a lot of the music went out of print for a long time. The lasting effect of 415 really, though, was that as an indie label, they did pioneer some guerrilla marketing and relationship marketing approaches to things. They really recognized the college alternative scene. And on the other side, they sort of serve as an object lesson of what can happen when you make a deal with the devil, as it were. 415 did really capture the zeitgeist of the San Francisco music scene, especially the scene that was centered around North Beach and Mabuhay Gardens. My book tells the story of all the bands, all nearly 30 of them, the Bay Area music scene as it intersected with those bands, and the 415 label. Now, after me talking and talking and talking, what I'm going to do now is play a couple video clips. Translator, I mentioned Translator. They're one of the highest profile bands on the 415 label. They were signed to 415 not long after the group relocated from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Translator is best known for their debut single, Everywhere That I'm Not, which was released in 1982 and featured on their debut album, Heartbeats and Triggers. Can you see that? There you go. Okay. And here's Translator guitarist Steve Barton talking about the early 415 Records days. Bear with me while I click on some buttons here.
What I thought I would do is sort of talk about what it was like for me to go to the 415 offices and
Great.
Try to paint a picture a little bit. I was living then, well, Translator had moved to San Francisco from LA, and we had all been living together in kind of a flat, with a friend's flat. I was sleeping on the floor. This might even be in your book. But then I finally moved out. We all kind of went our separate ways. And I was living in the Tenderloin, which is a part of San Francisco, and with a lot of lower income stuff. And I loved it. I was in this building, kind of not a flop house, but an apartment building. The bathroom was down the hall. You shared it with the other tenants.
Oh
And
boy.
when I moved in, the person who lived there before me clearly had used a bunch of hairspray constantly because that smell never went away. And I remember the the guy who was the manager of the place, he would get all the mail for all the tenants and then distribute it. And behind his door, he kept a baseball bat for protection, and that kind of a place. And I had a subscription to Rolling Stone at the time, and there was a bar down the street called the Edinburgh Castle, really cool Irish pub, and that I went to, and or Scottish pub, I guess, and went to. I was having a drink there, and the landlord came in, and he sat next to me with a copy of Rolling Stone. He had been reading my Rolling Stone, and it was the first issue that Translator was ever mentioned in.
Oh.
And he sat down. He said, "I didn't know I had rock stars living in the building." And then gave me my mail, and I said, "Oh, yeah." And from that was where I was living when we were making our first album, the Heartbeats and Triggers record. And I would go to the 415 offices, which were on Mission and 16th in the Mission district of San Francisco. And I loved going in there. It was great. I'd walk there, and you'd go in, and it was like a movie of an indie label. It was kind of chaotic, and kind of everything was by the seat of its pants, but also very focused and very into the music. And there'd be Denise doing the PR over here, and Chris Knabb would be over here. And I remember Howie Klein in his office, behind his desk, there was a big map on the wall of, I guess, the United States. And on top it said, all bands on tour all the time. And then it had little push pins in different cities where each band was color, coded, where they were on their tour itinerary. And I thought, that's so cool. And Translator was one of those pins, and I thought, this is so great. I'm so happy that this is happening. That I'm part of this. And downstairs there was a place, not part of the record company, called The Compound, but in the sort of local, people on the street, we all called it the Punk Mall.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It was like stalls and stands, and someone was selling clothes. There's a little record company, a little record store that had fanzines, and probably there was an espresso bar or something. It was that kind of a place. And I would hang out there a lot. And the Roxy Theater was across the street, which was a art house cinema. And that's where I'd see all these great Herzog films and all those great movies. And also down the street was a place called Cafe Picaro, which had just opened. And I'd go in there and hang out after being at 415 Records, and get coffee. And they had this incredible pan-grilled fish that opened in 1982. And I looked it up the other day to see if I was dreaming it, but it's still there. And
Really?
So the Punk Mall is not,
Right.
Now it's probably very, very expensive apartments or something. But then everything was very like stripped down. And then the Automat, which was a recording studio where we recorded the first two Translator records.
Right.
Well, we recorded the first one at our rehearsal studio, the basic tracks on a mobile truck.
Yes.
But we finished it at the Automat with David Kahn, and I could walk there too. And so I remember I wrote a song in that apartment, that kind of funky apartment. There was a song on the first record called When I Am With You. And I had been writing it, and it was kind of like I couldn't figure out how to do it. I hadn't played it for the band yet. And it was like, should it be like clipped little eighth notes, like things were back then, or should it be something else? And I put it on the radio, and Pete Townsend, there was a recording of him doing Won't Get Fooled Again, just acoustic somewhere, some solo acoustic version. Mm-hmm. And it was incredible. And I was like, that's it. It's a big strummy acoustic song, of course. And so on the record, it's a big, endless acoustic guitar that I overdubbed. And so that was exciting. That was all part of that period. But that's kind of what I wanted to do, is paint a picture of what it was like in San Francisco then. It was because we played all these different clubs, the MAB, the I-Beam, the Disc, all these different clubs, Berkeley Square, Stone, incredible places. Mm-hmm. And and 415 was kind of the hub, at least for our band and other bands, obviously on the label. It was like a real hub, and Howie Klein was such a music guy. And even though by the time we signed with them, they were part of Columbia, or CBS Records, it was called then.
Yes.
Part of Columbia. It still had that indie thing. Like I'd go to 415. It didn't feel like I was going to corporate record. Like when we were in New York and went to the CBS building, that was like a whole other thing.
I bet.
But Howie's thing was like very stripped down, chaotic, but he knew where everything was, and it was all under control, and he was always on the phone. I remember that he's always working the phone, because there was no email then, there was probably no fax then, you
Probably not.
Or letters, there was no it was a way different time.
Whoops, no, not yet. Wait a minute, Robert. So the let's see, guitarist Robert Darlington is the other songwriter and translator, and here he is telling the story of meeting another well-known musician who was also signed to Columbia Records.
But the story that I wanted to tell was one night when we were playing in Southern California. It was shortly after our third album, No Time Like Now had come, a second album, No Time Like Now had come out. And we had gone on a little mini tour of California, and we had played in Huntington Beach, which is, kind of a surf town, but it was at a club called the Golden Bear, which was kind of a mandatory place that you hit if you were in a band at that time, hitting the California circuit. So we'd had a really great gig there that night. And Huntington Beach is a little ways from West Hollywood, where we were staying at the legendary Tropicana Motel on Santa Monica Boulevard, which, has been a legendary place. I mean, Sandy Koufax, the Dodgers pitcher, owned it for a while in the 60s. Many bands have stayed there. They have like hourly rates, so you can imagine what that sort of thing. It was that sort of neighborhood at that time. Now it's been a lot more gentrified. But anyway, we got back to the motel, and my oldest friend Chris, who had introduced me to Elvis Costello and numerous other people, and got me very interested in the music that was happening in the late 70s and early 80s. He was with us back at the motel room, and I'm not sure who originally brought up the topic, but some of us were kind of hungry. It had been a long night. We're in Hollywood. We figured somewhere had to be open, so Chris and Larry Decker, bass player and translator, and I left the motel. We walked across the street, and we saw a sushi bar. So we walked up, and the door was closed, but we knocked on it anyway. And this guy answered the door, and we said, "Can we come in and just get something quick?" And he said, "Hey." So we walked in. He sat us down at the end of the sushi bar, just the three of us, and we were sitting there. And we were eating for a while, and we were being very grateful and talking to the owner a little bit. And I took Japanese for a while, so I understood some of what he was saying in Japanese.
Oh, wow.
So it was just a nice, quiet evening. Suddenly there's a knock on the door, and the owner gets up and he goes over and answers it. And there's kind of a pause there for a while. We don't really think of it. I mean, we think the place is closed. He's going to tell him to go on. And so he's like, hey. And Elvis Costello walks in. And we're kind of looking at each other like, oh, it's Elvis Costello. And anyway, they sit him down. Like, I think it was like right next to Larry, who I was sitting next to. And he's just kind of sitting there. And I think finally Larry said, well, we, just want to say, we're all huge fans of yours, blah, blah, blah. And he just really turned out to be a fantastic person. We just sat there, just the four of us, in this kind of dark Japanese restaurant eating sushi. And, there was much sake and beer and lots of sushi. So after a while, he got very animated and he kind of would jump up and do a Tony Bennett imitation that was just like incredible. But also, he was signed to Columbia at the time. And so, excuse me, a lot of the people who were, we felt at that time were kind of in the way of us progressing. We're kind of some of the same people that were in his way. So we were all able to get a lot off our chest. We eventually left, with, thanking the owner profusely. And it was just really late. We kind of thought about going and hanging out for a while somewhere back at the Tropicana. And he was staying at the Hotel Marmont, which is a really, expensive place that was down the block. But anyway, it was just great, because, to me, it was really wonderful to get to meet people who had really been influential in me deciding to go in the direction that I went with music. And, I got to meet, Joey Ramone and Chris France and Phil Lynott, all kinds of just, great musicians. And, the thing was, most of them were just very nice, down to earth, generally shy people, I mean, none of them were like these, kind of outrageous, the types of images that we see publicly are not generally what people are personally. It's something I think all of us kind of get into because we have that need. So, but it was just the meeting Elvis Costello was wonderful. The next day he was actually going up to play in San Francisco. And I think we were going to San Diego or La Jolla, somewhere down there, San Diego State. And there was a station at the time called The Quake that was playing a lot of new music. And he was doing an interview. And so I, of course, wasn't there to hear it, but people said that I know who did hear it say that he spoke really highly of us and he'd listened to the cassette we'd given him of the second album. He really liked it. And, he didn't really have to do that, but he, he's just a very genuine, great person. So, and so 415 really gave me the opportunity to be in that position to do that, and I felt very grateful for it. And
Translator's rock solid and inventive rhythm section is Dave Sheff and Larry Decker on bass. And as you might expect, they have stories too. First, here's Dave Sheff, and then Larry Decker will share a story of his own.
Which is we were in LA. Larry, correct me on anything I say here that may be in. We were in LA. We'd heard ourselves on the radio a lot, right, on KUSF here locally, because it was the local college station. Howie played us, and all the Denise and all the DJs played us. It was a popular song. But we got signed and things started moving, and we hadn't heard it on the radio, the real radio yet, commercial radio. And we were in LA. I think we were going to open for the Psychedelic Furs at the Whiskey. And we were driving, we're all together in a rental car, driving, I'm pretty sure, I don't know why I remember this so well, on either Beverly or Melrose, I think it was Beverly. On our way, I'm guessing to like get clothes or maybe talk to somebody at the label. I don't remember what, but we were driving down the street together and it came on the radio, and now from their hit record, Heartbeats and Triggers, Translator, everywhere, and we're like, oh my God. And we turn it up, we're listening, and we pull up to a red light and we look over and the girl in the next car is going, it was like, I'm a rock star. We are the Beatles. This is happening.
It was back in early 1984, and I believe we had come off the road and like after Thanksgiving of '83. And so we were just, hanging around getting new songs together. And we, in the early part of '84, we probably had about 50 or 60 songs that we were going to wade through and try to figure out, what to do with, if anything. Many of the songs ended up on our self-titled Translator album, the one with the flowers. And then the other songs ended up later in the evening of the Harvest album. Excuse me. And then we were also kind of in a creative evolutionary place at the time, and we were trying out new environments to play our music in, so to see how that felt. Some of those songs were coming out kind of acoustic-y, so we were just saying, let's see where that goes. And I had this apartment, or it's a flat actually, at 17th and Noe in San Francisco. And they had a little room in the, like a dining room, I guess. But we ended up setting up drums and amps and things in that room. And during the day, weekdays, we would kind of flesh out some of these songs. I remember some of them, like Gravity or Inside My Mind. Well, that was the thing, though. I was kind of concerned that maybe the neighbors were going to hate me for the rest of eternity. But it turned out that we were playing one time, and we ended the song, and my phone rang, and I was like, "Oh crap!" I answered the phone, and it was one of my neighbors, and he's got a real kind of solemn tone to his voice, and he goes, "Larry?" And I go, "Yeah, hey," and he goes, "I just have to ask you guys if you could turn it up. It sounds great." And so I'm like, "Really?" That's when you know the idea is that falls under the heading of, you're doing something right when ...
That I remember checking in to the Tropicana Hotel on Santa Monica Boulevard, which was where all the bands on a budget stayed in LA. And it was bands, rock bands, and rooms by the hour. And you could watch the Johns going in and out of the rooms. It was a wild scene. So we're checking into the hotel. It's us, Gang of Four, and the B-52s. B-52s are in front of us, are in the front, Gang of Four next, and then us. And we're like, we've made it. We are with these bands we totally respect, who we've toured with, where this is it, man. This is happening. And the B-52s check in, and then Gang of Four checks in, and we walk up to it's plexiglass, all kind of pitted and stuff. And there's a woman back there who's in her probably 60s with a beehive and a cigarette. And she looks up at me and goes, "And what little band are you?" And we were like, okay.
Early in the 415 days, Howie Klein welcomed a visitor to San Francisco, a fellow music journalist named Lester Bangs. For anyone who doesn't know that name, a fictionalized version of Lester was featured in the 2000 film Almost Famous, portrayed by Philip Seymour Hoffman. And like the film version of him, Lester Bangs was a kind of a larger-than-life character. And that day when Howie met Lester ended up being an important one in the history of 415 Records.
I didn't really know Lester. We had corresponded a little bit, and I knew him because I visited New York one time. I was living in Europe. I visited Richard Meltzer and Ronnie Hoffman, and one of them was grousing about Lester, that basically he was taking Richard's style and making it into something that was very successful commercially. I don't remember if that was Ronnie or Richard, but I recall it. I was in New York, and that's how I heard about Lester. That I read some of his stuff. I found it not really that much like Richard, but Richard would know better who's taking his style than I would. In any case, we wound up corresponding every now and then when I was living in San Francisco. And one day he said he was coming out there and let's get together. I said, great. And he came to my office, which was in that firehouse. We had taken over part of a firehouse. And he said, can you show me around town? And it was in the middle of the day. And I figured, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to be working today. So we started walking, and he bought a bottle of alcohol. Now, I don't drink. I've never had any alcohol in my life, basically.
Yeah.
And so I can't recall if it was scotch or vodka or Ryan. I wouldn't know one from the other. But what I do know is he was getting drunker and drunker and drunker as we were walking. And we literally walked the whole city. I mean, my office was in the Mission, and we wound up at the Mabuhay Gardens in North Beach.
Right.
And by the time we got there, he was as drunk as can be and falling over. He was already like laying on my shoulder, and he was a big, heavy guy. And I wasn't carrying him because his feet were on the ground. But other than his feet being on the ground, I was carrying him. So when I saw the Mabuhay, I thought, oh, even though it was afternoon, I figured we could just go in there, and that would be fine. And I heard music coming out of it. So I walked down the alley and sort of dragged him along, and the door was open, the side door. And when I walked in, there was a band playing, and Ness Aquino, who was kind of the owner of the place. I don't know if he was leasing it or he actually owned the building or what it was, but he wasn't really terribly involved with the music part. He owned the whole thing. He had a restaurant and a bar, and it was really someone else who worked for him who ran the music part, but he wasn't around. It was a band playing. So we walked in, and I kind of like shoved Lester onto a bunch of chairs so he could lay down and go to sleep, which is what he promptly did. And I sat there trying to figure out, what am I going to do now? Do I have to wait till this guy wakes up? Should I throw some water on him? I wasn't sure what I was going to do. But then I noticed that the band sounded really good, like really good. And I sat down and I figured I'd listen to them. So I did. And I realized after a couple of songs that it was actually a great band. They had never played out live, and they were auditioning, but not for Dirk Dirksen, who could actually hire them, but for Ness Aquino, who wasn't really the guy who hired bands, but whatever. I figured he would tell Dirk that this band was good, although how he would know the band was good, I don't know. But they were really good. In fact, they were so good that when they were done playing, I walked up to them and introduced myself and asked them if they would like to have a record deal with 415. And they said yes. And we didn't sign a deal at that moment, but I got their tape. I listened to it some more. I played it for other people, like Chris, and we decided that we would go through it. They were with it. They were the first band that we actually had a contract with. Previously, we had just, it was basically a handshake or some writing on the back of a napkin, literally. Right. But we had just been screwed over by one of our bands that way. It wasn't really the band that screwed us over. It was Warner Brothers, my future.
Right. Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
It was. Yeah. So I didn't want that to happen again. So we did do this deal with Romeo Boyd. Lester, when I asked him what he thought, he couldn't remember having heard a note. So, but eventually, I don't really remember how he woke up, or if I just stayed there for the rest of the night, or what happened. But I think I probably got him up and put him on a bus and dragged him back to wherever he was going.
Wow!
So that's my famous Lester Bangs story.
That's great. Was Ben Bossy with the band yet at that point? Okay.
No, he wasn't. That's a very perceptive question, because although I wound up loving Ben's music and Ben, when David Kahn went in to make to start recording with the band, they brought Ben, and David asked me what I thought, and I said, "Wow, he sounds really good, but don't use him on too many songs." Fortunately, no one listened to me, and Ben was, very much a star and everyone in the band was a star. But Ben became very, very integral part of the band, and was amazing. And you can't really imagine Romeo Void without Ben Bossy's saxophone.
I think I've pretty much run out of time, so I'm not going to show you any more videos. As I mentioned at the beginning, I interviewed 96 people for the book, and it was amazing to me how candid and open everyone was, and their stories form the larger narrative of 415 Records, and the book covers all of that and kind of what was happening in the scene there. And if Patricia has collected any questions for me, I would be happy to try to make something up to answer them.
Well, hello. I have to laugh because I not only love those interviews, but if there's time, I went to your website for Musoscribe about contact the author, and I just could not stop laughing.
Oh.
I could not stop laughing. And folks, if I don't get to it tonight, just take a moment to go to blog.musoscribe.com, and just, even if you don't need to contact Bill because you know him, just go and have a chuckle or two at that little piece of beautiful writing and the visual aid on what he's not looking for, because it's hilarious. Okay, it's just so funny. So yes, we do have some questions from our audience. First question, I'm just scrolling down. How long, Steve asks, how long did it take you to write this book?
90 days. Well, the thing is, I had an outline from the beginning that I was using as sort of a loose guideline to guide me through the project. I did all the interviews in the first quarter of last year. And what was amazing is that I did not put a narrative on this story. The narrative spoke to me out of the sort of interconnectedness of all the interviews that I did. It was like those interviews as a whole told me where to go. And so I just started writing, and I did all the writing in April, May, and June.
Well, all right, folks, you heard it here. That's the answer, Steve. Now the rest of us are going to go mix a gin and tonic and see if we can pull ourselves together. But we'll take that. Take that. Okay. Next question. What surprised you? This is from Audrey. What surprised you the most when researching this book?
I think what surprised me the most, I already had a sense that there were sort of individual music scenes happening in different cities, and that because we were living in a pre-internet age, the different scenes were only sort of vaguely aware of one another. As I said, I grew up in Atlanta, so I knew about the Atlanta scene and the Athens scene because that was only an hour away. And if I picked up a copy of New York Rocker or something, I could get a sense of what was going on in New York City, and so could somebody somewhere else in the country. But the individual scenes were somewhat insular in those days. But what I found the most interesting, and that came out through a lot of interviews, people would remark on just what kind of camaraderie there was in the San Francisco punk and new wave scene. Sure, there were rivalries, but to a large extent, it was kind of an art for art's sake kind of mentality, and kind of a sense of we're all in this together. And Translator in particular, who I played you some clips of interviews with them, part of the reason they were actually based in Los Angeles, but they moved to San Francisco in part because their impression of the scene there was that it was more sort of real, if you will, and less crassly commercial and less competitive. And so that was something that I didn't really know about until I started talking to people, but that idea was reinforced again and again and again.
Thank you. Next question from Linda. Why is it 415 and not 415? In parentheses, I love details.
Very good reason. Yes, it is 415 in a an inspiring bit of serendipity. 415 is, first of all, the area code in San Francisco, telephone area code. It also happens to be the police code for the San Francisco Police Department for disturbing the peace. And so with those two things being as a backdrop, it had to be 415.
Yeah. I mean, we have to have those ironies, don't we? Otherwise, why do we have artists to interpret them for us?
In addition, there was a song called 415 Music, although it's 415 is the name of the label, by the Ready Mades, who were a band that were for a while managed by Howie Klein, but were not actually on 415, although they did have the song 415 Music on the album 415 Music, the compilation record.
Okay, next question from Jay. Do you know if the book has been well received by the people you chronicled?
Pretty much, I would say, yeah. I mean, I really haven't had a bunch of people contacting me and saying, don't contact me again or anything like that.
No
Yeah.
follow-ups.
No follow-ups. No, I haven't gotten any poison pen letters. I suppose that's still a possibility. But the thing is I went into this not trying to dig or dish dirt. I love this music, and I'm really, really inspired by the artists who are on the label and the people who put the label together and ran it. And I really wanted to honor their stories. So, it's not a score settling book. It's although there are some, there's some mildly lurid stories in there, but nothing too scandalous. But no, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, quite honestly.
And then Jay has a follow-up question. What is it like to meet and talk to the people you listened to in college?
It's a bit surreal. I think we all remember when we were kids, we thought of adults, or adult rock stars or adult whatever kind of public figures. They were way taller than we were, and they were much, much older. Now with 30, nearly 40 years having gone by, I'm almost as old as most of these people, and we're more or less of the same generation. And so it's wonderful. It's really cool to be able to not go too far into fanboy mode, but to be able to tell them, thank you for the music. It meant a lot to me then, and it continues to mean a lot to me now, which is why I still have these records.
The personal anecdote about meeting somebody whom I admired was Lucinda Williams, Car Wheels on a Gravel Road. So I got to meet her in Deep Ellum in Texas, in Dallas, when she was touring with that album. I got to go backstage, and I really listened to myself, and I sounded like, I think I sounded kind of silly, and I was very self-conscious, but I so admired her, and I really loved what she was doing. And sometimes I just kind of feel like, well, that was me at that time. And what can I say? I was really struck by such incredible talent. And if I sounded like a doofus, I was kind of a doofus. Sorry, I just didn't. I didn't have a well-crafted response, but I'll never forget it. It was wonderful. Steve has another question for you. He says it's multi-part.
Uh-oh.
So get ready.
Okay.
Everybody have a refreshing drink. First, now it says first, I believe you are a musician. Okay. And as such, might have a deeper understanding of this music than the usual critic/author. Okay, now something else must be coming here, because boy, that's a preamble if I ever heard one. No pressure, Bill. And while we're waiting for, okay, here it is. Did you perform any of it? What? And was that part of the motivation and commitment to this project?
I think I have played a few of the songs by some of these artists in various bands that I've been in, but not too much. I guess I really haven't had quite the level of influence in the bands that I've been in to get those songs onto the set lists. But yeah, I definitely appreciate the, what's going on in the songs. As far as this book, as opposed to my first book, I didn't really go deep into talking about the structure of the music or anything like that. This is really more the story of the bands.
Where do you weigh in, Bill, on the artist versus the art debate? Loving songs or an album, but maybe then finding out things about an artist that are really, if not just sort of creepy or cringeworthy, maybe some things that are just downright disturbing. What do you think about that?
It's a tough one, and I think I pretty much, I don't really have a well-established policy on how I deal with that. In terms of my own listening, I think I probably approach things on an artist by artist basis. I mean, I many years ago, I bought some Ted Nugent albums. I've since gotten rid of all of them except the first one. I don't play it much, but I like it for Derek St. Holmes, is what I tell myself. There is some of that, but we have to. Well, we don't have to, but I mean, one approach is to try to separate the art from the artist and appreciate it, appreciate the art for what it is. I mean, Wagner was a pretty terrible person, but wrote some beautiful music. So it's a tough one, and I think we have to evaluate it on an ongoing basis, or at least that's what I do.
What's next for you?
I have I have 3 different book ideas rattling around in my head, and it's just a matter of which one of them makes it out of my head first, really. We'll see.
So any teasers about general topics, or do you always keep that really under?
Oh, no, I'm happy to spill the beans. Way back in the 60s, there was a television show that was on 5 days a week called Where the Action Is. And the stars of that show were Paul Revere and the Raiders. And their co-star was a teen idol named Keith Allison. In later years, Keith became a member of Paul Revere and the Raiders. He was a member of the band when they had their big late period hit, Indian Reservation. And Keith, over the last several years, had become a really close friend of mine, and we were working on his memoir. He does vocals on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. He was a roommate with Ringo Starr at Tittenhurst Mansion. He is in the Bee Gees' terrible movie, that Sgt. Pepper movie. He acted in films with Mae West and Tony Curtis. He was the band leader for Dolenz Jones' Boyce and Hart, the sort of Monkees revival in the 70s. As a solo artist, he opened for the Rolling Stones twice. He was a member of the post-Buddy Holly Crickets, on and on and on and on. He and I were working on his memoir. He passed away last fall. There is a possibility that we may find a way to move forward with that, because we did hours and hours and hours of interviews. So that's kind of first out of the gate. I've got a couple other book ideas that are bubbling under, but that one is already part of the way done.
Well, I've learned so much, and it's very humbling and so impressive, your knowledge and your deep respect for the artists of the new wave and the labels and 415 Records. And clearly from the clips you showed, the people you interviewed really appreciate your knowledge and understanding of their craft and what they were trying to accomplish. And we've listened to a wonderful presentation and set of interviews from Bill Kopp. And his latest book is Disturbing the Peace, 415 Records and the Rise of New Wave. You all have used the link that you used to access this on YouTube, and you can use it again because this was let's call this a deep cut. I would say this is a deep cut. And you can come back and enjoy it again. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, Bill, and thank you so much for your contribution to music journalism and music history.
Well, thank you, Patricia, and thank you to Malaprops for putting this together. It was really, I want to especially thank Howie Klein and Chris Knab for putting 415 Records together and for cooperating on this book. And it's really been a privilege to talk to all these people and to tell their stories. And I hope I did right by them.
Well, I think it shows through. Thank you all, everyone. We hope you have a lovely evening. Check out more author events at malaprops.com/events and have a good night.